Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the ideal strategy for every civilization in Age of Empires 2, and this will basically cover from Dark Age from the start of the game all the way up until Castle Age, and it will not talk about ideal compositions in the late game. If you want to know about those, check out either of those videos that are on the screen right now. Those cover late game compositions for every civ in a very similar style video. But in this video, let's talk about from opening of the game all the way up until Castle Age for every civilization, and of course we've got 45 now, so quite a lot to cover. We're going to go through these alphabetically, but there'll be a timestamp for every civilization so you guys can save some time and skip to your favorite civilizations to understand how to play them. Remember, by ideal strategy, I just mean this is what you'd want to go for pretty much every game if your opponent gives you the chance. Obviously, if you need to play a counter unit or play a different strategy or else you die, then do that. And just for clarity, I'm going to be keeping in mind the format being 1v1 Arabia, which is the most popular format. However, this could apply to a wide number of maps. However, it'll mostly apply to just 1v1s. All right, let's go ahead and hop right in, starting off with the Armenians. The ideal opening with the Armenians is probably the scout rush mixed in with some spears. The nice thing is you can make spears in Dark Age, so as soon as you get your barracks up, you can already send a couple spears forward and put some pressure on your opponent, and then following that up with your scouts just feels so natural. You want to play towards Castle Age as quickly as possible and get to your fortified churches because that allows you to play relic control with warrior priests. In Castle Age, you can easily play knights for a while until moving on to some of your stronger units like maybe the unique unit or champion in Castle Age, or sometimes even halberdier or whatnot. The important thing is getting those relics and playing with economy. Moving on now to the Aztecs, I think the ideal opening is some form of aggressive infantry, but my favorite is actually the Eagle Warrior combined with a range in Feudal Age. You can either go for Eagles plus Skirms when up against Archer civs, or Eagles plus Archers when up against Cav civs. I also recommend that you play with a lot of infantry in Castle Age, specifically Eagle Warrior plus Pike, and mix that in with some monks. That is the best way to play Aztecs by far. Eagle monk composition is so strong. Moving on to the Bengalis, I believe the best opening with the Bengalis is either the Scout Rush or the Archer Rush. I don't recommend you play any infantry with it because you really want to make use of the extra 2 villages you get in Feudal Age, and the best way to do that is just a fast feudal into a solid feudal opening, which is Scouts or Archers. It doesn't really matter what you go for. The important thing is though that you don't get Knights and Castles. If you go Scouts, make sure you're going to go Scouts into Light Cav and play with their monks, and if you go Archers, you'll be completely fine. No thumb ring, but you can easily go Archers into Expo and then transition into maybe something like the Ratha or the Elephant Archer later on in Castle Age. Monk play is huge with the Civ, definitely make use of those monks in Castle. Moving on to the Berbers, the ideal strategy here is simply to get the stable units or Camel Archer in Castle Age. The best way to do that is a Scout Rush because that gives you the option to go into either the Genitor, the Camel Archer, or just more stable units like Knights, Camels, or Light Cav in the best fashion. It lets you go for a Camel Archer and Genitor easily because that stable gives you access to Bloodlines and Husbandry. On top of that, Berbers don't get a lot of bonuses in Feudal Age, and so going for a stable opening and just chilling is probably the best course of action. You really pop off in the Castle Age onwards. Moving on to Bohemians, the best strategy is most likely just to open with Archers and Spears. I highly recommend that you play a passive Feudal Age with the Civ and try to get to Castle Age as fast as possible because that's where your Civ really comes online. You get to have a really smooth economy with your gold mining tax and stone mining tax coming in for free, and you can easily play Chemistry Expo or just Hand Cannoneer in Castle Age, which is probably their best strategy. Hand Cannoneers especially are extremely strong. Moving on to the Britons, you have a very simple game plan. You want to play with Archers as much as possible. Sometimes you need to mix in maybe Militia or maybe Scouts, but the ideal strategy is probably just to open with a 1-range Archer opening and save up till Castle Age. Once again, a pretty passive opening, but your goal is to get to Castle Age where you have those extra range crossbow and cheaper town centers. That is the best strategy by far with Britons. It just sets you up perfectly for the rest of the game. Moving on to the Bulgarians, the best opening is actually an aggressive one. It's probably going to be the Men-at-Arms Rush. You get free Men-at-Arms, and so going for 2 or 3 of these is probably the way to go. Even if Men-at-Arms is not the best strategy in the meta, the Bulgarians can do it very effectively. I highly recommend you follow this up with a quick range and blacksmith or a stable to make sure that your follow-up aggression is also quite strong. A lot of army in Feudal Age is definitely the way to go with Bulgarians. You want to make an uneven game state to follow up with Krepos Rush and a lot of army in Castle Age and try to make the game as messy as possible with you coming out with the map control. Very important to have map control to set up those forward Krepos with Bulgarians. Moving on to Burgundians, my favorite opening is basically the nothing opening. You want to go up to feudal age and just wall up with maybe a stable or a couple spears and nothing else, play defensive and just pick up bow saw, sometimes even heavy plow. Let's assume you just go for a stable, don't even care to make too many scouts, just enough to survive. If you need to make a range and skirms to survive, just do it. And the goal is to get to castle age and play light cav plus monk or cavalier plus monk for relic control. That is the best course of action with Burgundians, and the more passive you can play in feudal, the better it is for your ecotechs to kick in and get you ahead. Picking up those relics is the #1 game plan with the Burgundians, and once you do that, it's very easy to win the game. Moving on to Burmese, my favorite strategy is definitely something to do with infantry, since you do get that +1 attack starting in feudal age. I highly recommend the 2 militia feudal drush. I think this is the best way to make use of the Burmese economy as well as the +1 attack, and it also doesn't sink you too much investment like the men at arms do. It also lets you follow up with a range or stable and just play a standard game from there with a little bit of an early punch. Moving on to the Byzantines, we have a really simple game plan, with skirm and spear rush being the best early game strategy, and then getting into the castle age, you just want to continue with skirm and spear, like elite skirm pikemen, or switch to camel. All of those units you get a discount on, and that is by far the best way to play Byzantines. Just use those counter units that you get a discount on and develop your economy until you can get to Imperial Age. Moving on to the Celts, the best opening by far is the 2 militia feudal drush. I think this sets you up the best with Celts. Again, you could go for the men at arm rush like with their Burmese, but I just personally prefer the 2 militia. I think it's less investment and lets you get onto Celt ranges, which I think is the best part about the Civ in feudal age. Being on ranges is the best way to take advantage of the wood bonus, whether it's archers or skirms, and I think those units set up a nice siege play the best. Of course, you could also go stable and then go knight siege, but since you don't have bloodlines, if you go that route, you have to go for kind of like a Huang rush, like an all-in, and I just personally prefer the standard 2 militia into range opening for the Celts. Both are kind of equally good, and that's why I mentioned them though. Moving on to the Chinese, by far the best opening is the Scout Rush. It keeps you the most flexible, and the idea with the Chinese is just to survive the early feudal age and wait till your extra bills pay off, and you're just ahead by default. So going Scout and just controlling the game is completely fine. Scouts is also the most versatile strategy, and so with the Chinese, that gets you to all other variations, which is the best way to go about the Civ. Moving on to the Cumans, the best strategy in an ideal scenario is the 2TC play. It's simply the absolute best way to play Cumans, and sometimes it does have its downsides, but if you're able to do this uncontested, you will pretty much 100% win the game. Sometimes you do need to do like a couple archer ranges or maybe a stable to just survive, maybe a few spearmen, whatever the case may be. All of those are worth it as long as you can survive and stabilize on 2TC, you'll be fine. Moving on to the Dravidians, the ideal opening is resigning. No, I'm kidding. The actual best strategy for the Dravidians is the 2 range opening right away, where you're mixing in archers and skirms. I think this is the best way to play the Civ because you're just gonna get the best value out of your 200 wood from the start, and you're also getting onto a decent number of skirms, which is quite nice since your skirms fire faster. You can also mix in a couple spearmen if you're afraid of an early scout rush, but the idea is you want to put as much pressure as possible with the Dravidians in order to take advantage of that power spike with extra wood per age. Moving on to the Ethiopians, I highly believe the best strat is simply a 1 range archers, wait till castle age, and then go for expo. You can also go for expo plus 1 stable knight and go for a forward siege for kind of like a archer knight siege all-in push, but just simply best strategy being archers into crossbow into whatever else. It's the best way to play the Civ. It's an archer Civ. Moving on to the Franks, we're going to spend very little time here. The best strategy is by far scouts into knights and even into paladin. Truthfully, if you can do that, that's going to be the ideal Frank gameplay. Of course, usually you run into counter units, but generally speaking, scouts into knights is the best game plan for the Franks. Sometimes you have to mix in some skirmishers or something else, but this is exactly what you're trying to go for most of the time. Moving on to the Georgians, the best opening is by far the Scout Rush. I highly recommend you go for a fast up into the Scout Rush and you take advantage of the healing scouts like crazy. Into Castle Age, you want to develop your economy and get to Manaspa as soon as possible. The faster you get to Manaspa and start massing them up while not neglecting your economy, you do want a good economy with churches and town centers, then you just win the game. Manaspa is absolutely broken, and just double check if they got nerfed, because this video could be, maybe a couple years old if you're checking it out later. But if the Manaspa haven't taken a significant nerf, they are still going to be overpowered, and they're still going to be the best unit that Georgians can go for. They at the moment have no generic counter. You need something like a Mameluke to deal with them. Moving on to the Goths, the best thing you can do with them is probably infantry. Something like a 2 militia rush or men-at-arms is the best way to go. However, equally as good, I think, is the scouts and spearmen rush. That way you get a nice standard scout rush with the extra hunt bonus, and you also get the cheaper spears to mix in, and that's really good in scout for scout wars where spearmen get a lot of value. Moving on to the Gurjaras, you might think that the best strategy with this civ is to mass camels or maybe go for scouts in feudal age, but I highly recommend you go for the 1 range opening and you play towards archers into crossbow plus camel in castle age. Crossbow camel is an insane composition and definitely the way to go with Gurjaras in most games. Moving on to the Hindustani, I highly recommend you go for the scouts and stay flexible with the civilization. You have 2 main variations with the scout rush. After the scout rush, you can either switch to archers and play very aggressive, taking advantage of their scouts doing more damage to buildings, and if you combine that with archers, you can easily break into your opponent's base and win the game in feudal age. Or you can just go scouts into camels or scouts into light cav, and that is also a really good strategy. Moving on to Huns, the best strategy with this civ is scouts into cav archer or scouts into light cav. The reason why scouts is perfect is because it opens up the door to all of the good Hun units in castle age. If you go CA, you want to have the stable anyways, so might as well just open scouts. Going for a range into CA, like archers into CA, is kind of redundant because then you're going to be on range units the entire game, allowing your opponent to just easily counter you with skirmishers. Having that stable for scout rush and then walling up the base can make your opponent really guess whether you're going to go for knights, light cav, or you're going to go for cav archers. That mind game is crucial for the Huns. Moving on to the Incas, it's very similar to the Aztecs. The best strategy is actually Eagle plus a range, and in this case, it's best to do Eagle plus Skirm because you get a discount on all food units. And I think Eagle plus Skirm or Skirm plus Spear is the best opening for Incas in the right circumstances. You have to pick which one you want to go for. And then into Castle Age, you can pretty much do anything you want. There's no one way to play Incas. Moving on to the Italians, the best opening is actually one of 2. They're completely even. It's either the Scout Rush or the Archer, the 1-range Archer play, and both of them lead to solid units in Castle Age. You have fully upgraded Knights and fully upgraded Crossbows, so whichever one you want to go for in Castle Age is completely fine. The Italians are actually a very versatile civ. I just recommend you don't play with infantry options with Italians because you're trying to make use of that faster Castle Age. That is your best advantage with the civ, and infantry will actually slow you down from getting there. Next up, you have the Japanese. The best opening and the ideal strategy with this civ is just opening men-at-arms and playing with a fast range transition. Because the Japanese have a pretty bad late game, I highly recommend you try to gain an advantage and try to end the game as early as possible. The Japanese also have amazing ranges in the mid game, so I highly recommend whatever happens in feudal age, you end up on some form of range unit in castle age, be it crossbow, skirmisher, or cav arch. All of those units scale the best with Japanese, and the cav archers especially are quite strong. Moving on to the Khmer, the best opening is actually scouts plus full wall. The reason why full walling is really important is because you don't have a barracks, so if you're up against other scouts, you can't make spearmen, and so therefore full walling is the best way to defend your base. I also recommend you use houses to make sure you stay safe when going for that scout rush. The reason why scouts is so good with Khmer is because you can just make a bunch of farms that work super quickly and don't need to drop off food, meaning your food count is off the charts in the early game, and that's just the best way to set up your base for Khmer going into the mid-late game. Scouts into knights is completely fine, scouts into light cav is also good, and even scouts into full feudal more scouts is great as well because those farms are insane. Moving on to the Koreans, I think the best strategy here is honestly spear skirm or 1-range archers. Whatever it is, don't play with any infantry, don't play with scouts. Those units really just slow you down, and the idea with Koreans is you want to spam as many wood units as possible because you get such a heavy discount on those wood units. You just want to make as many of them as possible and scale into the mid-late game. In Castle Age, you want to basically continue doing the same thing, except now you can mix in towers or siege if you want to. Next up, we got the Lithuanians. You have basically one of 2 openings for the civ. Either you go scouts or spear skirm early on, or you can even go for a spear skirm forward. All of these are good strategies. The idea is you want to get to relics in the mid game. In the mid game, like Castle Age, you want to get maybe 2 monasteries or CA/knights or light cav. Whatever it is, just try to play for relics as much as possible. I highly recommend you stay on 1 TC for a little bit while fighting for those relics, and then adding in the TCs after you get the relics. That is the best game plan with Lithuanians, generally speaking. Moving on to Magyars, the best strategy is by far the Scout Rush. I wouldn't do anything else in 99% of the cases with Magyars. Getting cheaper scouts and forging for free just makes your Scout Rush insane. And I think going into Castle Age, it's kind of similar to Huns. You can either go into light cav/knight or you can go into cav archers. Both equally good, both scale insanely well. Moving on to Malay, the best strategy by far is the 2 militia drush after feudal age. This is insane. The 2 militia feudal drush is perfect because it takes advantage of your infantry armor coming in for free, meaning the militia are only taking 2 damage per hit of an enemy villager, making it obnoxious to deal with. And I don't like going men-at-arms with the civ because the civ just can't afford going men-at-arms. It's way too fragile in early feudal age. So the 2 militia drush is the perfect compromise. I also think sending spearmen forward as well with the drush is the way to go. Any extra usage of this free armor is probably the best way to play the civ. And then going on to the castle age, just try to stick with either elephants or range units / infantry units. Don't want to play with too many cavalry units as they're not going to bode very well with the Malay tech tree. Moving on to the Malians, the best way to play the civ is actually the 1-range archers. It might be tempting to go scouts with the civ, but the faster you can make use of that gold bonus, the better it is for you. So going 1-range archers into crossbows and castle, and then going for as many gold units as possible in castle age is the best strategy with the civ by far. The more you take advantage of this gold bonus, the better it is for you. Next up, we got the Mayans, and for the 3rd time, the best strategy is eagles mixed in with a range. However, unlike the Incas that want to go skirms, the Mayans just want to go archers because their archers are cheaper. So eagles plus archers is the best combo. And then in castle age, I think you want to be on crossbows for the most part, or maybe eagles in some scenarios. But if ideal case scenario is you on X-bows with Mayans, and you want to boom to an imperial age where you can play with all kinds of gold units. Next up, we got the Mongols. By far the best strategy is scouts into steppe lancers. If you can do this, it is insane. You can also go for the cheesy FC steppe lancers, which is also really strong. However, this is a bit of like a cheese strategy. It could either work really well or it could just completely fail. But generally speaking, you know, scouts into steppe lancers is the safer way to do it, and steppe lancers from Mongols are absolutely busted. Best way to play the civ by far at the moment. Otherwise, you just want to play scouts into cav archers or scouts into Magyars. Whatever you do, just open scouts and you have a really good time with Mongols. Next up, you have the Persians. I think the best strategy with this civ is probably scouts into knights / camels or light cav. I think that's the best way to play the civ by far. A lot of people are talking about Persian CA, and I know the Parthian tactics available in castle age could appear to be kind of nice, but honestly in testing, it's really just not that good of a bonus, and the upgrade itself is quite expensive when going CA in castle age, so I highly recommend you just play cavalry units and boom towards something like Savar late game. Next up, we've got the Poles, and while the Poles can be a bit of a tricky civ, I think the best opening is probably something like the Scout Rush plus farming as much as you can. I also think going for a forward Tower Rush with the civ is a really good opening as well, kind of tied with the Scout Rush. If you can go for a Tower Rush, it's probably the way to go in a lot of cases, and if the map is not suited for a Tower Rush, then just go Scouts and wall up your base. Especially if you have a nice map, that's the way to go. The more walls you get, the better, because securing those 4-walk farms is the best strategy by far with the Poles. In Castle Age, you want to boom and play all-in knights with that unique tech. That is the best way to play Poles, and that is what your main strategy is in most cases. Next up, we've got the Portuguese. Similar to the Malians, the Portuguese want to play a 1-range opening and play with as many gold units as possible, starting with archers into Expo Knight or Expo Siege. Whatever you do, make as many gold units as possible, and that is the best game plan with the Portuguese. You can also open with a couple militia since you get a light discount on them, but honestly, I would just skip that step entirely and open with just straight up archers. Next up, we got the Romans. I think the best opening with Romans is not infantry at all. I think it's just Scout Rush. Honestly, going for the men-at-arms and the infantry armor is a little bit of like an overcommitment to feudal age for my taste. And although it's a powerful strategy, I think it's kind of easy to stop with your opponent going range. By going for a Scout Rush, you take advantage of the Romans' economy, and you can go for infantry after opening scouts by transitioning to longswords in Castle Age. The idea being the scout and spear opening is the most practical way to make use of the strong economy from the Romans and opens up your options in the best way possible. Next up, we got the Saracens. I think the best opening with the Saracens is quite similar to the Gurjaras. 1-range archers, don't mess around with any infantry, make a market and try to get up to Castle Age as fast as possible. Once in Castle Age, you can either go for an archer plus siege push to break into walls quite easily with your bonus to break in walls faster, or you go crossbows plus camels if you're scared of any cavalry. Your camel has so much HP in early Castle Age that strategy is basically an auto win versus cav civs. Saracens are amazing right now. Use the strategy and you have a lot of success. Moving on to the Sicilians, the best strategy with this civ is by far the Sergeant play. FC Sergeant is the best strategy with the civ by far. I know it's a cheesy strategy in some regards, but just going for a fast castle, cutting vil production, and going for a donjon with a few sergeants and then sending those forward to make more donjons in your opponent's base is just by far the most deadly opening you can go for. If you want a standard opening, the best one is Scouts plus Spears because that lets you farm the most and get Horse Scholar, but honestly, that opening is really just not that strong, so the best opening is actually the fast castle, all-in rush with the sergeants. Next up, you've got the Slavs. I think the best opening with Slavs is Scouts, once again the most flexible, and I think it leads you into either longswords with free supplies and gambesons, or into your cavalry play plus siege. That's the best way to play Slavs. The Scout Rush allows you to farm faster, and so Scouts into knights into farms or siege is just the best way to turbo Slavs into the late game. You also get monks that move faster, and monks plus cavalry is a really good combination. So with Slavs, the only time you want to be on a range is if you need defensive skirmishers. Otherwise, just play with your cavalry or your infantry and you'll be more than fine. Moving on to the Spanish, your opening can actually vary quite a bit, but the best strategy with this civ is by far just getting onto conks. If you can get onto conks, you'll have a good time in most cases, and so whatever you want to open, be it scouts or spear skirm, or even Spanish archers is not bad. Whatever you do, just try to get the conks, and that is the best way to go. I would treat feudal age as just a transition to securing stone and getting to conks as soon as possible. That's what I would do with Spanish. The conquistador is by far your best unit, and mixing that guy in with some missionaries or monks or even mangonels can make for a deadly castle age push. Moving on to the Tatars, they are very similar to the Huns. I highly recommend you open with a Scout Rush and then transition into either Steppe Lancers, Camels, Light Cav, or Knights, a very diverse stable, or transition into CA. The best way is transitioning into CA. That's going to get you the most value out of the Civ, because CA with free Thumb Ring are absolutely insane. Highly recommend you play towards that with the Tatars, but your stable option is also just as good. Those two strategies are the best way to play Tatars. If you're curious, Thumb Ring Expo by opening one range is probably the next best opening, but I highly recommend you play towards CA because that unit scales way better than Expo. Next up with the Teutons, the best opening or the best strategy is actually the Tower Rush. I think this is the best way to play Teutons, and although you don't want to Tower Rush every game, if you can go for the ideal opening, then it is Tower Rush. It sets you up the best for the mid game, and it's the best way to make sure that mobility won't be an issue. Teutons struggle a little bit with mobility, lacking husbandry. By going for a Tower Rush, you will get free murder holes in Castle Age. You get to garrison a lot of villas into those towers, making them extremely powerful, especially in a tower v tower war, and it makes it so you rely less on mobility in Castle Age, since you already have an established forward pressure on your opponent's side of the map. If you don't want a Tower Rush, I think the best opening is actually playing some form of archer opening, because Scouts the Spears kind of leads into Knights. Without husbandry, it's not so good. By opening archers, you get to develop your base, and the cheaper farms combined with the archer opening feels really smooth to just develop into that mid-late game. Obviously, you want to transition off of archers eventually, so don't play archers forever, but opening range with Teutons feels really good, as wrong as that sounds. Moving on to the Turks, you've got a couple really good strategies that you can go for that in my opinion are equally good. You can either go Scouts and play them like Huns, so Scouts into Light Cav, Knight, Camel, or Scouts into CA, that's one route, or you can play them similar to Saracens and play one range archer opening, taking advantage of their gold mining bonus, and then playing archer plus Camel or archer plus Light Cav in Castle Age. Both of those openings or both of those strategies are very good, and honestly, you only want to rely on gunpowder in certain scenarios with the Civ. I think their generic units and their generic strategies are probably the best way to get out of the early game. Moving on to the Vietnamese, a lot of people might think that the one range archer opening with the Civ is the best, but I actually think it's Scouts into Skirms or Skirm Spear that feels like the best strategy with Vietnamese, or even Scouts into Cav Archers. Those strategies feel a lot better than just one range archers, and I stand by that for quite a long time now. The problem is with going straight archers is that you don't have camels to transition into a solid castle age, so you're kind of just stuck on crossbows the entire game, which lets you get countered by skirmishers, even though in theory your skirmishers are better. If you transition to skirmishers after opening crossbows, then it just feels like you're committing double for the same value being on skirms. So I'd much rather just play Spear Skirm to get onto skirms myself, or Scouts into CA, making use of their really strong 80 HP CA in Castle Age feels amazing. Moving on to the last civilization here, last but not least, the Vikings. I think the best opening with Vikings is actually the 2 militia drush post feudal age. Getting that extra HP, getting that early pressure, and letting you seed a bunch of farms behind is the best way to take advantage of a decent early game with a nice economy. Playing a passive feudal age after the drush and aiming for castle age and playing for an economy based castle age is the best strategy with the Vikings. Your main goal is basically just to get to a faster imp and win the game at that timing after doing a bit of damage in feudal age and a bit of damage in Castle Age, and focusing most of your effort on just pulling ahead economically with your free wheelbarrow and free handcard bonus. Remember, the Vikings late game is pretty bad, so winning an early imp is absolutely key, otherwise you're going to be in a lot of trouble against some heavy strong Imperial Age civs. Well, that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys use this video as a resource that you can come back to at any time to see what to do with a certain civilization. And I hope you guys can recommend this to a lot of your friends that are new to the game. Me personally, I don't have friends, so I can't recommend this game to anybody. So recommend this video and this game to your friends and allow them to get better at the game by knowing the ideal strategy with every civilization. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you guys want more content from me, check out my Twitch live stream, link in the description, and also check out my Patreon for exclusive guides and content, link also in the description. Thanks for watching, and peace.